Chapter 16. The Alcoran or the Sword. August 6, 1838 was Election Day in Missouri, and the Mormons for the first time in 5 years were choosing to vote. John D. Lee lay sprawled upon the grass in the public square at Gallatin, the county seat of Daviess County, where the vote between the Mormons and the Old Settlers was expected to be close. He listened in silence while one of the candidates, William Penniston, harangued against the Saints. "They are a set of horse thieves, liars, and counterfeiters. They'll swear a false oath on any occasion to save another Mormon. They are thieves and knaves and dupes in the bargain, and no property is safe in Daviess County if they continue to pour into this area. If you suffer the Mormons to vote in this election, it will mean the end of your suffrage." When the first Mormon stepped out of the group and walked silently over to the polls, a grinning settler barred his path. "Daviess County don't allow Mormons to vote no more than—" racial slur, he said. When the man began to argue, the Missourian knocked him down. Immediately, a fight broke out. The Mormons, about 30 in number against over 200, were standing conveniently near a pile of oak hearts, each one 4 feet long and weighing about 7 pounds. They made, said Lee, a very dangerous yet handy weapon. Lee jumped into the melee when he saw John L. Butler give the Danite signal for assistance. "I was an entire stranger to all who were engaged in the affray," he wrote, "but I had seen the sign, and, like Samson when leaning against the pillar, I felt the power of God nerve my arm for the fray." Butler was signaled out for the especial attack, but he knocked a man down with every blow of his club. "When I called out for the Danites," he wrote later, "there was a power rested upon me such as one I never felt before. I never struck a man the second time, and while knocking them down, I really felt that they would soon embrace the gospel." The riot was short, for the Missourians fled before the billets. Not before 9 men were stretched out on the ground and a score of others were crawling away fearfully bruised. Butler then climbed to the top of the pile of lumber and said quietly, "My ancestors served in the War of the Revolution to establish a free and independent government, a government where all men have equal rights. I aim to have my rights as a free-born citizen, even if I have to fight for them. As for my religion, that's a matter between my God and me, and no man's business but my own. This day I'm going to have my vote, and I'll die fighting before I'm driven from these polls without it." The little knot of Mormons, still gripping their oak hearts, proceeded to the polls unmolested, and every man voted. This incident smashed the fragile peace that had prevailed in Upper Missouri. Actually, no one was killed in the fray, but the runner who had brought news of it to Far West said that 2 Mormons had been slain, and that Adam Black, who was justice of the peace in Gallatin, was uniting the Gentiles in an army to expel the whole colony of Adam from Daviess County. Avard at once called out the Mormon troops in Far West, and Rigdon spurred them to deeds of valor. Now we as the people of God do declare and decree," he shouted, brandishing his sword, "by the great Jehovah, the eternal and omnipotent God that sits upon his vast and everlasting throne, beyond that ethereal blue, we will bathe our swords in the vital blood of the Missourians or die in the attempt." Joseph accompanied the little army to Adam, where he learned that the election riot had been much exaggerated. Instead of returning to Far West, however, he made the mistake of marching his men to visit the justice of the peace, Adam Black. He entered Black's cabin with Avard and several others and demanded that he sign an agreement of peace. After some argument, Black wrote out a statement promising to support the Constitution, and the Mormons retired. As soon as the rabid Mormon baiter Penniston learned of his visit, he magnified it into a story of intimidation and threatened murder, advertising the incident clear to Jefferson City. The judge of the circuit court, Austin A. King, who had hated the Mormons ever since his brother-in-law had been killed in a Mormon Gentile riot in Jackson County, immediately issued a warrant for Joseph's arrest. Knowing that a trial in Gallatin was an invitation to a lynching, Joseph refused to give himself up unless he could be tried in his own county. When Lilburn Boggs, now governor, heard of this, he ordered out 6 companies of militia to enforce King's warrant. Joseph capitulated, but through the intervention of his lawyers and old friends, Doniphan and Atchison, he won the concession that he be tried, not at Gallatin, but half a mile inside the Daviess County border. The prophet then stationed his own army along the county line and went to trial secure from the threat of an impromptu hanging. He was bound over on a $500 bond to keep the peace. The trial did nothing to mitigate the hatred intensifying against the saints. Millers refused to grind Mormon grain at any price, and flour in Far West soon disappeared altogether. The women tried to boil the unmilled wheat and grated their corn on crudely perforated tin pails. The corn proved edible when baked with pumpkin, but the wheat was sodden and indigestible. Hundreds of newly arrived immigrants, living in covered wagons or bark tents, looked at the fast-approaching winter with panic. Armed bands of Missourians prowled about, firing haystacks and granaries, stealing horses and cattle, and whipping Mormon farmers. Daily it became clear that in every county save Caldwell, the Gentiles were hell-bent to drive the Mormons out. Soon the two big Mormon settlements of DeWitt and Adamondiaman were in a state of siege. The women and children herded behind hastily improved stockades, living off cornmeal and freshly killed cattle. When these provisions were gone and the Mormon men were worn out with watching, the land agents who had originally sold them their property sent word that they were willing to buy back the preemption rights whenever the sect agreed to leave. This extortion turned the Mormons sick. By this time, the prophet had expanded in the Danite band into the armies of Israel, which included nearly every able-bodied Mormon. One convert, after describing in a letter the duties of the various companies, guarding, spying, foraging, arms manufacturing, and so on, wrote frankly, "Those companies are called Israel's army because the prophet Daniel has said they shall take the kingdom and possess it forever." Despite the extensive organization and drilling of this army, it was still purely defensive. Joseph forbade any retaliation for the depredations of the old settlers and worked desperately with his lawyers to effect a peace. For a time it seemed as if his prudence would bear fruit. Doniphan came very near wiping out the Daviess County trouble by persuading the old settlers to sell out to the Mormons at a good price. But before this plan could be worked out, the old settlers in Carroll County formally demanded that the Mormons leave DeWitt, the Mormon river port. They set the deadline at October 1. Joseph replied coldly to this ultimatum by reinforcing the town with 200 newly arrived Canadian converts, whereupon the Missourians laid siege to DeWitt in earnest, firing on everyone who approached. When General Lucas, who commanded the militia in this area, heard of the skirmishes, he wrote to Governor Boggs, "If a fight has actually taken place, of which I have no doubt, it will create excitement in the whole of Upper Missouri, and those base and degraded beings will be exterminated from the face of the earth." Under cover of darkness, Joseph made his way to the beleaguered town. He found his people desperate for food and fuel and pathetically eager for miracles. The Missourians had caught some of the men out foraging and had beaten them into unconsciousness with hickory whips. The prophet looked at their backs ribboned with welts, and the rage that was so slow to mount in him surged into his throat, but he could not call down thunderbolts, and that is what it would have taken to aid these saints, outnumbered as they were 10 to 1. "Come back to Far West," he told them dully, and sent out a flag of truce. When the wagons filed into Far West, a sullen, hopeless anger swept over the people. One woman, weak from childbirth, had died on the way, and when they learned of it, the oldest converts began to count again the toll of martyrs to the gospel. But the younger men were cold to memories and eager for revenge. Nothing was gained by surrender, they said, nothing but death. And when Doniphan brought word that negotiations with the settlers in Daviess County had broken down and a mob of 800 men was threatening to devastate Adamondiaman, it seemed a confirmation of their worst fears. "If Carroll County can root the Mormons out, why not Daviess?" the old settlers were arguing. "To hell with compromise! To hell with Doniphan's peace settlement! The land sales are coming on, and if we drive the Mormons out, we can get all the lands back to preemption. We can get all our land back again as well as all the pay we've got so far." Joseph called every able-bodied Mormon in Caldwell County to the Far West Public Square. There, on October 14, he broke his long public silence. "We are an injured people," he began. "From county to county we have been driven by unscrupulous mobs eager to seize the land we have cleared and improved with such love and toil. We have appealed to magistrates, judges, the governor, and even to the President of the United States, but there has been no redress for us. The latest reply of Boggs to our petitions is to tell us to fight our own battles, and that, brethren, is exactly what we intend to do." The crowd cheered his sober words as they had never cheered Rigdon's most truculent outbursts. "I have great reverence for the Constitution," he went on, "but for the laws of this state I have no regard whatsoever, for they were made by a parcel of blacklegs. General Doniphan has authorized this body to act as a regiment of the state militia under the command of Colonel Hinkle. We are therefore acting within the law. All who are with me will meet tomorrow to march to the defense of Adamandi Ammon with the words of the Savior ringing in our ears. Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his brethren. He looked over the crowd as if searching for a familiar face. Some of the brethren aren't here today, he said. Some of those that Brother Sidney likes to call, "Oh, don't," men. In time of war we have no need for such. A man must declare himself friend or enemy. I move a resolution that the property of all "Oh, don't" men be taken over to maintain the war. As the crowd laughed and applauded, Rigdon started up, his eyes blazing. "And I move," he shouted, "that the blood of the backward be spilled in the streets of Far West." But Joseph silenced him. "No, I move a better resolution. We'll take them with us to Davies County, and if it comes to a battle, we'll sit them on their horses with bayonets and pitchforks and make them ride in front." The men cheered, and the tension relaxed a little. Joseph went on to tell an anecdote. An army captain was stationed in a village with his regiment, which badly needed food. The captain found a Dutchman with a rich harvest of potatoes, but the man refused to sell. Explaining the matter to his men, the captain thrice warned them not to let him catch them touching the potatoes, but the next morning he paused. There was not a potato in the whole patch. The men grinned. Their families were hungry and wretched. They had lost horses, cattle, blankets, and wheat to their neighbors and needed no bolder hint. As Joseph neared the end of his speech, all the pent-up hatred that had so long suppressed with unexpected violence broke forth with unexpected violence. "If the people will let us alone," he cried, "we will preach the gospel in peace. But if they come on to molest us, we will establish our religion by the sword. We will trample down our enemies and make it one gore of blood from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean. I will be to this generation a second Muhammad, whose motto in treating for peace was the Alcoran or the sword. So shall it eventually be with us. Joseph Smith or the sword." 100 Mormons marched into Adamandi Ammon the next day to reinforce the 250 men assembled under Lyman White. After a conference with the prophet, White addressed his men. He stood by a fine brown horse with his famous bearskin flung over the saddle. A red handkerchief was bound about his head in Indian fashion, with the knot in front, and the collar stood open, showing his naked, hairy breast. "The sword now has been drawn," he shouted, flourishing an enormous cutlass, "and shall not be sheathed until we have won back everything the mobs have wrenched from us. Our cause is just. The Lord is on our side, and it makes no difference if our enemies number 50 or 50,000. White's fierce aspect and bravado caught the men up in a wildest enthusiasm. John D. Lee said that he felt himself bulletproof. "I thought that one day I would chase 1,000 Gentiles and 2 could put 10,000 to flight." The Gentile spies who heard the speech rushed away to spread the news that the wild ram of the mountains had 15,000 men under arms ready to descend upon mob and militia alike. News that the Mormons were on the offensive was a terrific shock to the Gentiles in Davies County. They scattered into the wind. When David Patton charged into Gallatin with a mountain company, he found it almost deserted. The men promptly looted Jacob Stallings' store and then set fire to it along with several cabins. Young Oliver Huntington, who had already joined the Danites, but had forbidden to go on the expedition to Gallatin because of his tender years, climbed Tower Hill and stood on Adam's altar to see what he could of the expected fight. "I saw the smoke rising towards heaven, which filled me with ambition," he related. "In tears I looked far over the trees, and wished and sighed and hoped, and wished again that I was there. The next day I went to Bishop Knight's and saw the plunder, and heard them tell in what order they took the place." While Patton was raiding Gallatin, White with another company attacked Millport, and Seymour Brunson attacked Grindstone Fork. They rounded up all the horses, cattle, and hogs they could find and drove them back to Adamandi Ammon, but did not burn the cabins. Back in Far West, Rigdon spread news of victories and applauded when the first wagon piled high with consecrated property pulled into the square. But he was quick to see that the plunder was a horror to many saints. One by one, the disapproving and the faint of heart stole away with their families in the night. News of every fresh defection made Rigdon wild with anxiety. When Thomas B. Marsh, president of the Apostles, and Orson Hyde, also an apostle, joined this exodus, he mounted his stand in the schoolhouse and blistered them with his hate. The last man has run away from Far West that is going to. The next man who starts shall be pursued and brought back, dead or alive. I move a resolution that if any man attempts to move out of this county or even packs his things for that purpose, then any man in his house who sees it shall, without saying anything to any other man, kill him and haul him aside into the brush. All the burial he shall have will be in a turkey buzzard's guts, and nothing will be left of him but his bones. Yesterday, he finished significantly, one man in Far West slipped his wind and was dragged into a hazel bush for the buzzards to pick at, but the man who lisps it shall die. By this time the Gentiles had learned of the Mormon depredations. Within a week, every isolated Mormon cabin was a pile of ashes. The old settlers blandly set their intentions to the press. We believe in less than 6 days Far West will be burnt and her fugitives driven from the borders of the state. When Joseph ordered everyone into either Far West or Adamandi Island for protection, Gentile spies spread the report that an immense Mormon army was gathering which would lay waste to the whole upper portion of the state. 2 of the worst Gentile incendiarists sent an express to Governor Boggs on October 24, reporting that the Mormons had massacred a whole militia company of 50 men. Richmond, they said, was to be attacked at any moment. We know not the hour and the minute we will be laid in ashes. Our country ruined. For God's sake, give us assistance as quick as possible. The letter was a fantastic fabrication. The militia company in question, led by a Methodist minister, Captain Bogart, had been ordered to patrol the border of Caldwell County, and on the day of the supposed massacre it had done nothing more exciting than to enter the county illegally and capture 3 Mormons. This capture, however, had tragic repercussions, for the Mormon scout who brought news of it to the prophet was certain that the 3 men who were to be shot at sunrise. Joseph at once dispatched 60 men under Captain David Patton to effect a rescue. Bogart's men were strategically entrenched behind a slough bank in the scattering of oak timber on Crooked River. A thick grove of hickories on the nearest edge made it impossible for anyone approaching from east to discover the militiamen until practically upon them. The 60 Mormons came up over the ridge at dawn, their bodies silhouetted against the brightening sky. The guards took careful aim and fired, killing 1 Mormon outright, and then fled to give the alarm. Patton at once ordered a charge down the hill, and the men rushed down in a fast trot, shouting, "God and liberty!" Patton led the charge, his white coat gleaming in the early light. The Mormons made perfect targets, and 3 or 4 fell at the first volley. But the men rushed on into the oak grove with drawn swords and charged over the slough bank. All of Bogart's men fled but 1, who hid behind a tree long enough to take careful aim at Patton's white coat. Struck in the abdomen, Captain Fearnought dropped to the ground. He died that night in terrible agony 3 miles outside Far West. The fight was over and won and the prisoners released, but instead of exultation the Mormons were overwhelmed with gloom. Patton, a man of great strength and courage, who had been the most beloved of all the apostles. "Alas," wrote John D. Lee, "my dream of security was over. One of our mighty had fallen, and by Gentile hands." The Battle of Crooked River was reported to Governor Boggs as a massacre by the Mormons, although Bogart had actually lost but 1 man and the Mormons 3. The women and children were flying from Richmond in every direction, Judge Ryland wrote on October 25, and the city is expected to be sacked and burned by the Mormon banditti tonight. We have since 1 o'clock this evening about 100 well-armed and daring men, with the full determination to exterminate or expel them from the state en masse. On the same day that this deluge of rumor and falsehood reached him, Governor Boggs received the sworn statements of the 2 Mormon apostles, T.B. Marsh and Orson Hyde, exposing the Danites, admitting the burning and pillaging of Gallatin, and giving a detailed account of the prophet Muhammad's speech. They reported that the Danites planned to burn Richmond and Liberty and poison the wells and food of the old settlers in an effort to start a pestilence. Even General Atchison, who until now had believed that the Mormons were entirely blameless, wrote angrily to Boggs, "From the late outrages committed by the Mormons, civil war is inevitable. They have set the laws of the country at defiance and are in open rebellion." Boggs had never lifted a finger to stop the 5-year-long depredations of the old settlers against the Mormons, but this news of the first Mormon resistance galvanized him into action. He wrote to General Clark on October 27 a command that was even more shocking than his past lethargy. "Your orders are to hasten your operations and endeavor to reach Richmond in Ray County with all possible speed. The Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state, if necessary for the public good. Their outrages are beyond all description." The prophet, meanwhile, was energetically preparing far west for a siege. His men tore down cabins to build breastworks to prevent the cavalry from charging into the town, and hastily gathered in supplies of food. Blacksmiths hammered out crude swords and pikes from every available piece of steel. The women packed their bags and prepared to flee with the children northward into the scanty woods. Joseph walked about the town, directing the measures for defense and calling out encouragement to every gloomy face. Coming upon a group of disconsolate guards shivering over a few firebrands, he caught first one and then another by the shoulders, shaking them roughly. "Get out of here and wrestle, run, jump, do anything but mope around. Warm yourselves up," he cried. "This inactivity will not do for soldiers." Forming them into a ring, he stepped inside and challenged them to wrestle. Catching his spirit, the men one by one stepped into the ring to try their strength, while the others shouted and applauded. Not one could throw Joseph, and finally, laughing and sweating, he left the ring to make way for a lesser man. As the sport went on, the crowd grew boisterous. Suddenly, Sidney Rigdon broke into the ring, sword in hand, crying testily, "You are breaking the Sabbath, and I'll not suffer it." For a moment the men were abashed and silent. Then one bolder than the rest called to the prophet, who had been watching Rigdon with a curious expression, "Brother Joseph, we want you to clear us from blame, and we formed the ring by your request. You told us to wrestle, and now Brother Rigdon is bringing us to account for it." "Brother Sidney," Joseph answered deliberately, walking into the ring, "you had better get out of here and let the boys alone. They are amusing themselves according to my orders. You are an old man. You go and get ready for the meeting and let the boys alone." Then, catching Rigdon off guard, he knocked the sword from his hand and caught him by the shoulder. "Now, old man, you must go out, or I'll throw you down." John D. Lee, who was watching the spectacle, said that the prospect of a tussle between the prophet and the mouthpiece of the prophet was fun for all but Rigdon, who pulled back like a crawfish. Joseph knocked off his hat, dragged him bodily out of the ring, and with one jerk of his wrist ripped his fine pulpit coat from the collar to the waist. Then turning to the men, he said, "Go on, boys, and have your fun. You shall never have it to say that I got you in any trouble that I did not get you out of." When Rigdon began whimpering about the loss of his coat, Joseph said, "You were out of your place. Always keep your place and you will not suffer. You have no one to blame but yourself." After that, said Lee, Rigdon never countermanded the orders of the prophet, to my knowledge. He knew who was boss. By October 29, the outlying Mormon settlements had been evacuated except one. On a creek several miles from far west, Jacob Hahn had just finished building a flour mill, which he swore he would not desert to a Gentile arsonist. "You would better lose your property than your lives," the prophet told him, but Hahn was unconvinced. When he departed, Joseph turned to Lyman White and John D. Lee, gravely troubled. "I wish they were here for their own safety. I am confident they will be butchered in the most fearful manner." On October 30th, the Mormon scouts and picket guards were driven into far west by the approach of a large body of militia. Colonel Hinkle, who was in command of the Mormon troops, had been out with the scouts, one of whom noted that when they were most hotly pursued by the militia, Hinkle had turned his coat inside out. This act was reported to Joseph with a warning. "He's a fair-weather saint, and you'd better watch him close." John D. Lee heard the prophet thank the scout for the information and warn him to keep it secret. "It's a bad time," he said, "to ventilate an act like that." The Mormon force guarding far west was about 800 strong. It was badly armed, many of the men having no muskets, being armed only with single-shot pistols or homemade swords. But there was a considerable ammunition, and the morale of the men was high. "Now, Father," wrote one Mormon in a letter on October 28, "come to Zion and fight for the religion of Jesus. Many a hoary head is engaged here. The prophet goes out to battle as in days of old. He has the sword that Nephi took from Laban. Is not this marvelous?" The militia halted just outside range of the Mormon guns, and the two forces watched each other warily. During this time, a messenger from General Doniphan slipped into the far west with a message for the prophet. It was a copy of Boggs's exterminating order. The note said further that the dreaded Samuel Lucas, armed with this order, was on his way to far west with General Clark and 6,000 men. That night, a wounded man stumbled into far west with news that froze the blood of every saint. The settlement at Hahn's Mill had been attacked by 200 militiamen. The Mormons had fled into the blacksmith shop, which they thought would make an admirable fort, but it had proven instead to be a slaughterhouse. Great cracks yawned between the logs of the shop, and the Missourians, hiding behind trees, picked off the Mormons at their leisure as if they had been killing cattle in a pen. When the women fled towards the brush, the men shot at them in derision. Old Thomas McBride fell wounded and surrendered his gun, whereupon one of the mob coolly hacked him to pieces with a corn cutter. After shooting down every Mormon they could see, the mob entered the blacksmith's shop to finish off the wounded. They found 9-year-old Sardius Smith hiding under the bellows. His younger brother, shot through the hip, and pretending to be dead, heard the men drag Sardius from his out from his hiding place. "Don't shoot," said one militiaman. "It's just a boy." "It's best to hive him while we still can. Nits will make lice," a man replied, and placing his rifle near the boy's head, blew out his brains. When darkness came, the women crept back to the scene of carnage. Of the 38 men and boys in the camp, 17 had been slain and 15 wounded. Fearful that the mob would return, the women lowered the dead into an unfinished well, hid the wounded in the woods, and then, stunned and desolate, made their way towards Far West. As news of the massacre spread among the saints, the men cursed as they had not cursed since they joined the church. But everywhere there was a deep conviction that the Hans Mill colony would have been spared had Han heeded the prophet. There was no sleep for Joseph that night. He could not help feeling answerable for the horror, and in Far West he could see on the morrow a Hans Mill massacre repeated 100 times. His scouts were hourly bringing him reports. The militia was doubling, trebling. Already the saints were outnumbered 5-1 in fighting men, and within 2 days 10,000 men would surround the town. Joseph knew his men well. He could list the lily-livered on his fingers and call the old don't men by their first names. Sending secretly for John Corral and Reed Peck, dissenters whom Doniphan knew and respected, he said to them, "Find General Doniphan, and beg like a dog for peace." But knowing that his overtures might be spurned and that any hint of capitulation would demoralize his men and bring the militia whooping into the town, he played out his role of magnificent resistance to the end. When his men gathered before him the next morning, he met with them in resolution and complete assurance. "I care not a fig for the coming of the troops. We've tried long enough to please the Gentiles. If we live together, they don't like it. If we scatter, they massacre us for it. The only law they know here is that might makes right. They are a damned set, and God will blast them to hell. If they try to attack us, we will play hell with their apple carts. Before now, men, you fought like devils, but now I want you to fight like angels, for angels can whip devils. And for every one we lack in number to match the mob, the Lord will send an angel to fight alongside." Before the day was over, Corral and Peck returned with word that Major General Lucas, who was in command, was willing to meet the leading elders of Far West under a flag of truce between the lines. Shortly afterward, a delegation of militiamen approached with a white flag, and Joseph sent to meet it Colonel Hinkle, Corral, Peck, W. Phelps, and John Clemenson, all of whom he suspected of turning against him. A compromise must be made on some terms, he said, honorable or dishonorable. Lucas's terms were harsh. He demanded first, the surrender of the Mormon leaders to be tried for treason. Second, the confiscation of all Mormon property to liquidate Mormon debts and to indemnify the old settlers whose property had been damaged. Third, the immediate mass migration of all Mormons from the state. And fourth, the surrender of their arms. The alternative to these terms was annihilation. Hinkle requested a 12-hour delay, but Lucas insisted on having Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Lyman White, Parley Pratt, and George Robinson as hostages. If by morning the Mormons still wanted to fight, he said, he would guarantee the prisoners' release. When Joseph heard the terms, he called in his leading men who were in most imminent peril, chiefly those who had figured in the battle with Bogart's men, and bade them flee northward out of the state. He ordered that all the plunder taken from the Gentiles gathered together in one house, lest every man who was found with a saddle or blanket not his own be hanged for stealing. Then he called his troops together and addressed them sorrowfully. "You are good and brave men, but there are 10,000 men approaching Far West, and unless you were angels themselves, you could not withstand so formidable a host. You have stood by me to the last. You have been willing to die for me for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, and that is offering enough in the sight of God. The bloodthirsty Lucas has demanded my surrender, and I shall offer myself up as a sacrifice to save your lives and to save the church. Be of good cheer, my brethren. Pray earnestly to the Lord to deliver your leaders from their enemies. I bless you all in the name of Christ." General Lucas, impatient at the delay and suspicious of the treachery, meanwhile ordered his troops to march on the city. When they were within 600 yards of the breastworks, the Mormon hostages came forward. Upon sighting the white flag, the militia sent up a yell of triumph. "If the vision of the infernal religions could come suddenly to mind," wrote Parley Pratt in his autobiography, "with thousands of malicious fiends, all clamoring, exulting, deriding, blaspheming, mocking, railing, raging, and foaming like a troubled sea, then could some idea be formed of the hell which we had entered." The prisoners lay that night in the open ground, sodden and disconsolate, taunted by the guards and pelted by the rain. About midnight General Lucas appeared out of the darkness and called Lyman White aside. "I regret to tell you your die is cast, your doom is fixed, and you are sentenced to be shot tomorrow morning on the public square at Far West at 8 o'clock. White spat contemptuously. "Shoot and be damned." Lucas looked at him with mingled admiration and regret. "We were in hopes you would come out against Joe Smith, but as you have not, you will have to share his fate." "You may thank Joe Smith," White retorted, "that you are not in hell this night, for had it not been for him, by God, I would have put you there."